Okay, let's unpack this. There's this fundamental human dilemma that I think really gets to all of us. Doesn't matter if you're, you know, trying to stick to a diet or just get to bed on time.
Right. The gap.
The gap. We often we know the best thing to do. We have the knowledge. Maybe we've even gotten really good at it, achieved a kind of mastery.
But then the pressure's on.
And we just struggle. We can't seem to execute.
It's that huge yawning space between knowing what to do and actually doing it, isn't it? And when we see that in ourselves or in someone else, the first place we go is...
Character flaw.
Exactly. Lack of willpower, laziness.
Yeah.
We frame it as a personal moral failure.
But what if it's not? I mean, what if that whole internal fight, that friction, but what if it wasn't a personal failing at all?
What if it was imposed on you?
Yeah. Structurally imposed.
Yeah.
What if your environment was literally set up to stop you from living by your own values? And what if the very effort of holding on to that knowledge while being forced to act against it was physically damaging you?
Like actually blocking your body's ability to heal itself.
Yes.
Well, that's exactly the mission of this deep dive. We're looking at source material coming out of the pure mental health community, and they have a term for this.
What's the term?
They call it hypocrisy under constraint.
Hypocrisy under constraint.
And we're going to really do a sort of surgical examination of how that tension, that constant disconnect between what you know is right and what you're forced to do, how it physically depletes you, how it sabotages your body's regeneration and just discounts your own good intentions.
So we're talking about real physical consequences.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to get into the hard biology, the stress hormones, what happens to your metabolism, the kind of physiological wear and tear that literally can make you feel older.
And we'll look at the specific barriers, right? The things the sources point to.
Yeah. Things like restrictive housing or mandated treatment plans in institutions enforce dependency. Basically how these environmental constraints directly suppress your immunity, your ability to thrive, your health in every possible way.
So the takeaway for you listening is that this is a huge shift in perspective.
It is. The idea that some of our deepest struggles with health and self-control, they might not be flaws in your character, they could be structural injuries.
It's a new way to understand why you might feel stuck.
And it suggests that reclaiming even a tiny bit of autonomy, a free choice, might be the most powerful regenerative medicine there is.
So to really grasp how damaging this constrained behavior is, we have to start with what's being damaged. The sources begin with this idea of mastery.
Right.
It's a pretty big word. What exactly do they mean by mastery here?
So mastery, and they use dietary master as their main example, but it could be anything. It's so much more than just, filming a good habit.
It's not just following a diet plan.
No, not at all. It's a reflection of some really sophisticated internal stuff. We're talking about deep self-awareness, moral reasoning, a really robust capacity to make intentional decisions.
Okay, so if I have dietary mastery, it means I've done the work. I didn't just read a book. I've consciously reflected on my choices.
Exactly. You understand the nutritional impact, how food affects your body, your mood, your energy.
And I've probably integrated some ethical thinking too, right? Like where my food comes from or sustainability.
That's the core of it, yes. It's intentionality that's built on a foundation of knowledge and personal values. It takes real self-regulation to fight your impulses and stick to those long-term goals.
So you're basically establishing your own boundaries for your body and your ethics. You're building an internal compass.
A moral compass, that's a great way to put it.
And that capacity, the self-discipline, the reflection, the intention, these are all incredibly positive traits.
They are. They're signs of high-level cognitive function, of real personal agency.
So they represent a kind of peak state.
A peak of self-realization in that area, yeah. And that intentionality, that discipline, that's actually what sets the stage for how destructive the conflict becomes later on.
How so?
Because it's that conscious awareness of the ideal, that muscle memory of living in alignment that becomes the source of the pain, source of the depletion when the constraint gets introduced.
Okay, so that's a really critical distinction.
Yeah.
We're not starting with someone who just lacks self-control.
No, quite the opposite. We're starting with someone who put in the cognitive work, the emotional labor, to achieve that control.
And then it gets taken away forcibly.
That's the foundation of this entire concept.
Yeah.
If the person didn't have that knowledge, that mastery, then being forced to do something would just be, an unfortunate circumstance. It wouldn't be a conflict.
But because the knowledge and the discipline are there.
The external constraint forces an act of self-betrayal. And that is so much more taxing on the entire system.
All right, so we've got this foundation of mastery. Now, the external system, the constraint, enters the picture. How does this lead to what the sources call structural hypocrisy?
Well, the tension just explodes when these systemic constraints, and we're talking about things like intense, chronic stress, or rigid schedules you can't control, isolation.
Things that make it impossible to practice what you've mastered.
Exactly. Let's go back to that person with dietary mastery. They know their body needs fresh vegetables, lean protein, maybe ethically sourced stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Now, put them in a constrained environment, an institution maybe, or a situation of deep poverty where the only food they can get is, high sugar, prepackaged rations.
So for survival, they have to eat it. They comply on the outside. They eat the food to avoid, starving or getting in trouble.
Right. But what's happening on the inside?
A war.
A constant war. They're experiencing this huge psychological and moral disconnect. There's their deep knowledge, the healthy, ethical choice they work so hard to master, and then there's their action, which is just whatever is possible in that moment.
Let's talk about the term itself, hypocrisy, because normally we think of that as someone deliberately being deceptive.
Yeah.
How is this different?
The sources are really clear on this. This is not hypocrisy in that traditional moral sense. It's structurally imposed.
It's not a choice.
It's not a choice. It's the tension between knowing what's right versus what's possible when your agency is just completely suppressed by the system. The person isn't choosing to be fake or to betray their values. Their freedom to act authentically has been taken away by the environment.
Sounds exhausting. Just a constant drain.
It is. Your body is basically living in an environment that demands you betray your own highest values every single day.
And what's the long-term result of that contradiction?
They call it the depletion engine.
The depletion engine.
Yeah. It's a drain on every level, psychological, ethical, and physiological. It just burns through all your energy at once. Think about the moral energy alone.
Right.
You're constantly suppressing the urge to fight back, constantly trying to find a better option, constantly weighing the risks of not complying. It's chronic cognitive dissonance, 24/7, and it depletes your physical resources right alongside your moral ones.
So let's break down the immediate practical fallout from that. Because it's not just a feeling, it affects your ability to function. The sources mentioned degraded self-control.
Right, which seems so counterintuitive, doesn't it, if the person had mastery before?
Exactly. How does that happen?
It's a really crucial physiological feedback loop. When you're under that kind of prolonged systemic stress, it actively messes with the higher functions of your brain, your prefrontal cortex.
So executive function, impulse control.
All of it.
Yeah.
When your nervous system is stuck in survival mode, which is what these environments do, your brain literally stops putting energy into long-term planning or complex ethical thought.
So the environment essentially forces you to dumb down your thinking, to just focus on immediate survival.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
And that, ironically, dismantles the very skills you'd need to make a good choice if you ever got the chance.
Precisely. Your brain adapts to survive the now, not to uphold your values for the future, and this feeds into what the sources call ethical dissonance. The knowledge of what's right is still there. In fact, it might feel even sharper because of the contrast. But you can't act on it. And that creates this constant throbbing moral tension. You know what you should be doing, but the structure only allows for this compromised, lesser action.
Which has to lead to guilt.
Daily corrosive guilt. And that's the final piece. The psychological strain. When you are always aware of that misalignment between your deepest intentions and your forced actions, it just breeds this intense anxiety, this guilt, and a feeling of powerlessness.
Diminished self-efficacy.
Yes. And it becomes a vicious cycle.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is. The environment prevents the right action, which causes stress, and that stress then degrades your ability to take the right action if a small opportunity does pop up. Your own awareness becomes part of the burden. You're just constantly arguing with yourself inside your own head, and that mental argument has a very real physical metabolic cost.
This is where this deep dive really gets to the core of it, I think.
Yeah.
We're moving from the psychological side to the hard, measurable physical damage. We're not just talking about feeling stressed anymore. We're talking about the precise biological mechanisms that get switched on by this chronic conflict.
The sources are incredibly clear on this. The constant moral struggle under constraint triggers systemic stress pathways. And that leads to accelerated physiological wear. The moral fight is literally being recorded in your body's chemistry.
It's a biological breakdown started by an ethical problem.
That's it.
Okay, let's get into those mechanisms. Let's start with a hormonal response. What exactly is happening with cortisol?
So the key mechanism here is the sustained activation of the HPA axis. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis,
The body's main stress response system.
the central command for stress.
Yeah.
And this constant conflict knowing versus doing triggers a relentless, sustained flood of stress hormones, mostly cortisol, but also things like adrenaline.
So what happens when cortisol is always high? It's supposed to be a short-term thing, right?
It is. It's an alarm system, but when it's chronically elevated, it forces your body into this state of constant low-grade alert, and that is incredibly expensive, metabolically speaking. Cortisol's job is to dump energy, glucose, into your bloodstream for an immediate threat.
Which leads us right into the next point, metabolic disruption. How does that hormonal storm mess with your body long-term?
Well, that constant flood of glucose, combined with the chronic inflammation that comes with stress, eventually leads to what we call insulin resistance.
So your cells stop listening to the insulin signal.
They get desensitized. Your body is screaming full tank with all this glucose, but your cells can't use the fuel efficiently. So energy gets diverted away from crucial things like cell repair and nutrient absorption towards immediate inefficient fuel storage, usually fat, often around the midsection. The outcome is just profound metabolic imbalance. Poor digestion, compromised gut, systemic inflammation.
Which is the driver of almost every chronic disease.
Exactly. And the sources use a specific term here. They say this physiological depletion accelerates physiological wear.
That's more than just feeling tired.
Oh, yeah. It's measurable damage at a cellular level, chronic inflammation, and oxidative stress. They damage our telomeres.
The little caps on our DNA that are linked to aging.
Right. And when that process is accelerated by the stress of this constrained hypocrisy, it directly contributes to you feeling less resilient. And the sources say it shortens your perceived and maybe even your actual lifespan.
That is just staggering.
Yeah.
The idea that a lack of free choice, when you know better, literally contributes to physical wear that could shorten your life.
The body is keeping score. It's recording the cost of that moral battle at a cellular level.
And it doesn't stop there.
No.
What about cognitive decline?
The conscious effort of managing this internal conflict, this chronic cognitive dissonance, is just neurologically exhausting.
Yeah.
That fatigue prevents your brain from getting into the deep restorative sleep cycles it needs.
REM sleep, slow wave sleep, the stuff you need for repair.
Right. And bad sleep directly tanks your immune system, which makes you more vulnerable. And of course, it further degrades your executive function.
And that vicious cycle again.
It is. Your brain, just trying to survive in this contradictory environment, starts to suppress those sophisticated high-level functions. Long-term planning, ethical reasoning, they all take a back seat.
Yeah.
The system locks down and prioritizes immediate compliance over everything else.
There's a concept in here that I find just so tragic. The idea that the individual's own positive intentionality, their mastery, their discipline, gets weaponized against them.
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? And it's rooted in consciousness.
How does that work exactly?
Well, that intentionality, that strong moral compass that says this is the right way to eat or this is how I need to manage my day, that becomes the very thing that makes the conflict so intense.
Because the system is so rigid.
It's unyielding and often punitive. So the person has to comply. They have to avoid really serious consequences like losing their housing or facing some kind of institutional punishment.
So, because they have this advanced knowledge, failing to act on it feels like a self-inflicted wound, even though it wasn't their choice.
Yes. The knowledge itself creates the friction that then depletes their physical health. If they were ignorant, if they didn't know the better way.
They'd still suffer from the bad food or whatever, but not this extra layer of damage.
Exactly. They wouldn't have this specific accelerated cost of the moral and cognitive dissonance. The act of knowing and being forced to fail creates a constant state of self-betrayal.
And this creates what the sources call the masked contradiction.
Right, because to an outsider or to the system that's monitoring them, their compliance looks like acceptance.
They see someone taking the medication, eating the food.
And they assume that person is either okay with it or just doesn't have the willpower to do better.
But inside,
there is this intense, hidden strain. And that's what makes it so depleting. They're constantly burning energy to suppress their true values in favor of what's expected. It's invisible, but it's incredibly taxing. That moral energy, the energy you need to maintain your sense of self, is being spent just managing the cognitive load of knowing right but being forced into wrong.
So it's not just stress, it's an accelerated, measurable physiological breakdown.
The individual is sacrificing their physical body to survive the constraint.
Okay, we've laid out the internal cost, the physical cost,
Right.
but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Let's pivot to the actual environments, the systems that create these impossible situations.
Right. We need to map the architecture of constraint.
These aren't just abstract ideas. The sources point to very specific things that dismantle a person's ability to choose.
Very specific. And they detail several big categories.
Let's start with behavioral health systems, because that gets right to the heart of bodily autonomy.
It really does. This category covers things like mandated medications, institutionalization, treatment plans that are just incredibly rigid and govern every minute of your day.
So, for example, if a medication is mandated,
The individual is stripped of the most fundamental decision about their own body. They might have achieved mastery over their sleep or diet. They might know exactly what helps them feel stable, but the institution schedule says otherwise. Or maybe a side effect of a coerced medication causes extreme fatigue, which completely undermines any effort they make with diet.
so their knowledge and the system are in a direct fight, and the system holds all the cards.
The system always wins because the cost of not complying is just too high.
Okay, what's next?
Then there's correctional and supervisory factors. This is any kind of supervision that restricts basic freedoms, movement, communication, and a really big one, access to resources.
Especially resources like good food.
Exactly. Think about someone with that dietary mastery we discussed. They know what their body needs to heal. But the institution gives them limited, controlled, and often nutritionally terrible options. Their ability to practice their own mastery is just systematically blocked by the architecture of the place.
And this isn't just about formal institutions. The sources talk about economic and housing instability.
Which is a huge and often invisible constraint for millions of people. Financial pressure, restrictive housing. It forces you into this brutal survival mode where you have to make decisions based on what you can afford right now, not what's good for you in the long run.
So the person with dietary mastery knows they should be buying fresh produce.
But the only food they can afford is cheap, processed, high-calorie stuff. They're forced into this hypocritical position every single day, and that brings on so much shame and guilt.
They have to trade their long-term health for short-term survival.
Health for safety, health for solvency.
Yeah.
And finally, the sources point to social isolation.
As a structural barrier.
Absolutely. When you're marginalized, when your support networks are stripped away, it becomes so much harder to live in line with your values. Community is what supports resilience and consistency. Take that away, and you've created another barrier between intention and action.
So the common thread here, through all of these, is that internal control is replaced by external power.
That's the core of it. Decision-making is externally constrained. This is the absolute definition of what they call constrained agency.
So the resulting behavior isn't a personal failure.
It's a result of forces outside the self. It is not a moral weakness. The person's conscience is still there, but the environment is actively hostile to it.
What does this do to a person's sense of self, their identity in the long run? The sources talk about this hindering self-realization.
Well, when the environment forces you into these specific behaviors, compliance, survival mode, just suppressing what you want and need, you can't explore who you really are. You can't enact your own goals, your values, your talents.
It's an injury to your potential.
It's an injury to your soul, not just your circumstances. You can't become who you're meant to be because the structure won't let you.
And that leads to something they call identity fragmentation.
Yeah. It's this profound disconnect that happens when you can't align your actions with your own moral code. If I see myself as a disciplined, healthy person, but my daily life forces me to be undisciplined and unhealthy.
Who am I?
Exactly. Who am I if I'm not the sum of my own choices? It creates this massive crisis of self.
Which must create even more psychological distress.
It does. It just compounds the anxiety and guilt we were talking about. This fracture in your identity just consumes so much mental energy.
Okay, so let's summarize this section because it's a critical point. These environmental constraints, they suppress immunity, prosperity, health, all of it. Why?
Because of the chronic cognitive dissonance they create?
The war inside.
Yes. The failure to practice your own autonomy directly leads to chronic stress, to that sustained activation of the HPA axis. And that chronic stress is the engine of the physiological wear and tear, and it's the primary suppressor of your immune system.
So when your values are constantly being shut down and your choices are taken away,
The emotional labor, the anxiety, It just weakens your body's defenses. It messes with your digestion, it disrupts your sleep, and it systematically sabotages your immune system, health, prosperity in that bigger sense of just being vital and aligned. It's only possible when your ability to care for yourself is structurally given back to you.
Okay, this next part of the deep dive brings in a really crucial moral and spiritual framework.
Yeah.
The sources use it to draw a very sharp line between a real moral failure and behavior that's just coerced.
It's a powerful tool for someone going through this.
So how do they distinguish coercion from failure?
The pure mental health perspective is really clear on this. They define true hypocrisy as something that requires a voluntary contradiction.
So you have to have the freedom to choose.
Yes, you have to have the freedom, the capacity, the awareness to do the right thing, and then you deliberately choose not to, maybe for personal gain or something. That's a clear ethical failing.
But the situation we're talking about, hypocrisy under constraint, is totally different.
Fundamentally different, because that freedom of choice has been removed. Yeah. So in these constrained environments, behaviors that look like they're out of alignment with someone's values are explicitly not considered ethical failings. Because the person's freedom is compromised, their intent might be pure, their mastery might be fully developed, but they just don't have the external ability to act on it.
The struggle itself is a sign that their conscience is intact.
Exactly. And that distinction is so important for recovery. It helps reframe all that guilt. The intense emotional fight they're feeling isn't a sign of weakness. It's proof of an ethical conscience battling against huge external pressure. It validates their internal war.
So the source material then brings in a specific biblical context to reinforce this idea.
It does. It applies some of these universal biblical principles to these very modern systemic constraints, especially around how morality is judged when someone is confined or coerced.
And what's the core principle they're pointing to?
The core idea is that Scripture consistently makes a distinction between actions taken under duress or confinement and true moral failure.
Okay.
The overriding principle is that a divine evaluation focuses on a person's heart, their intent, their conscious awareness, not on circumstances they can't control.
So the ethical judgment is based on your awareness and your intention, not just the action itself when it's forced.
Precisely.
So if we apply that to the modern systems we've been talking about, mandated treatment, institutionalization, poverty-driven choices.
They can be understood as modern versions of confinement or coercion, situations where a person's actions are dictated by forces way beyond their own control.
That's the explicit link they're making.
It is. The biblical principle suggests that being compelled to act by these systems doesn't equal moral condemnation. The evaluation rests on their awareness and intent, which, as we've said, is often still fighting that contradiction. It's not based on the behavior that the external structure demanded.
It has to be such a powerful counter-narrative for someone who's beating themselves up over behaviors they were forced into just to survive.
It is. It gives them the moral clarity to separate their ethical self, which is still aligned, from their constrained self, whose actions were compromised.
And having that clarity.
That clarity provides the spiritual and moral framework you need to start reducing that psychological strain. If you can externalize the source of the conflict, if you can see that the moral problem is with the system, not with you, you can finally begin to heal internally and get your mind and body ready for actual physiological regeneration.
So if the problem is a structural constraint that turns your own mind against you and runs this depletion engine, then the solution has to be about restoring freedom, restoring agency.
Exactly. How do you start the engine of regeneration?
So what do the sources say is the precise mechanism for that?
Regeneration kicks in the very moment an individual starts to regain agency and self-determination. That shift immediately starts to undo the damage. It's like the body gets a signal that the war is finally winding down.
Okay, so let's walk through the concrete benefits of that. The first one has to be stress reduction.
That's the primary engine of healing. When you get back your power to make decisions, you're no longer constantly fighting that internal battle between compliance and conscience. That immediately lowers your cortisol levels. It lets the HPA axis normalize.
And when cortisol drops,
your body can finally redirect energy back to where it's supposed to go. Maintenance, repair, proper digestion, bolstering the immune system, it supports your whole being, mental and physical.
And that transition from survival mode to proactive choice, that must be key for the brain as well. What about neurobiological repair?
It's crucial. The sources note that structured recovery helps improve executive function, emotional regulation, all of it, over time. When you don't have to focus on immediate compliance anymore, those higher-level brain functions that were shut down can be gradually reactivated. You're strengthening the neural pathways you need for discipline and planning again.
So the cognitive issues caused by constraint,
Mhm.
they aren't necessarily permanent.
No, they seem to be functional suppressions that are reversible
Through what mechanism?
through rebuilding self-efficacy. Every time an individual makes an autonomous decision, even a tiny one, and sees a positive result.
Like choosing a healthy breakfast.
Exactly. Or managing one small part of their schedule. That strengthens their confidence. It rebuilds trust in their own judgment, which is the absolute core of self-mastery.
But you can't just flip a switch and say, be free now. What kind of structure is needed for this to work?
Right. It needs support. The sources list 3 critical actions. First, the restoration of choice. That means providing real, meaningful opportunities for people to make decisions about their own lives, their routines, their diet, their health, and moving away from rigid one-size-fits-all plans.
And second,
Safe practice. The person has to be genuinely supported while they're practicing making choices again. They need an environment where a setback is seen as part of the learning process, not a moral failure that gets them put back under more constraint.
and the final piece is reintegration.
Yes, you have to restore those social relationships, those community networks. That's essential for emotional well-being, and it reinforces the new consistent behaviors because you have a support system that mirrors and validates your aligned values. The community confirms the self that was suppressed for so long.
So this isn't just a roadmap for the individual. It's really a set of instructions for everyone around them. What's the main takeaway for peers and consumers who are in this struggle right now?
The core message is one of radical self-affirmation. That internal tension you feel under constraint. It's normal. It is not a moral failure.
Your survival adaptations were a sign of strength.
A sign of fierce resilience and wisdom, not weakness. They should celebrate every small gain in autonomy and recognize that the very act of struggling against the system is proof of their intact ethical awareness.
And how does this change things for professionals who are designing these support systems?
It requires a dramatic shift in focus. They have to design interventions that actively enhance agency, that provide flexibility, that systematically tear down the structural barriers.
So a goal isn't compliance anymore.
The goal is enabling internal autonomy. They have to recognize that prescribing a rigid treatment plan with no room for a person's conscious, value-driven choices is just perpetuating the system that caused the damage in the first place. Flexibility isn't a bonus, it's a therapeutic necessity.
And what about families and networks who are trying to support someone?
Their role is to reinforce autonomy at every single opportunity. They have to acknowledge that the survival adaptations were necessary. They have to provide a safe space to practice making choices, free from judgment about past behaviors.
Now listen.
Critically, they have to listen to and validate the person's own values, even if those values conflict with what a professional is saying.
So at the end of the day, the goal of recovery is to heal that fracture we started with, the gap between knowing and doing.
It's about reestablishing integrity. Recovery works to bring intention and behavior back into harmony. And when that happens, you reduce the internal strain that causes all that physical depletion.
So true mastery isn't just about personal discipline.
According to these sources, it's about having the structural freedom to align your awareness, your intention, and your action. And restoring that integrity is what regenerates your health, your vitality, and your resilience.
So we started this deep dive with this idea that knowing the right thing to do can actually hurt, especially when you're powerless to do it. And we've spent this time really analyzing how that conflict, that hypocrisy under constraint, isn't some philosophical problem. It's a precise physical depletion engine. It compromises our metabolism, our immune system, our ability to heal.
The core message from these peer sources is pretty revolutionary, I think. Being well-informed, having that mastery, it's just not enough if your environment won't let you act.
Our physical health is directly tied to our sense of autonomy.
It's intrinsically physically linked. Our immune response, our metabolic health, maybe even our lifespan. Constraint doesn't just block our health, it actively vandalizes our biology by forcing us into a state of conscious contradiction.
Which means those survival adaptations, the things that look like compliance or a lack of willpower to someone on the outside, they're actually signs of incredible resilience.
It's the body and mind fighting to survive a hostile structure, and the depletion, the exhaustion, that's the cost of winning that war.
It's the cost of the fight.
Right. And your knowledge of right and wrong, when you can apply it consciously, is a powerful protector of your health. but only when you have the freedom to do so. The second that freedom is taken away, that very same knowledge becomes a weapon that accelerates your own physical decline until you can reclaim your autonomy.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. We've talked a lot about huge systemic failures and the massive physical price of these constrained environments. But what about right now? For those of us who aren't in a position to just walk away into total freedom.
What's the power of the individual within their current limits?
Yeah.
Well, consider this. Every single intentional choice, no matter how small it seems, is a victory. It's a victory for yourself, for your autonomy, for your well-being. It's the start of regeneration.
So reflect on this for a second right now as you're listening. What is one small intentional choice you can reclaim in your life today? It could be about your food, your schedule, setting one tiny boundary.
Even the smallest refusal to participate in something that feels wrong.
Because that one small victory for your own autonomy, that's what begins the complex, necessary, and beautiful process of regeneration.